Thank you. This is on, I hope. It is. Well, many of us who have covered national security issues for many years have only relatively recently turned our attention to the impact that climate change has on national security, and indeed, the Pentagon itself, the national security community in Washington. I would say this is a relatively recent, but nonetheless incredibly important shift of attention, and that's going to be our topic for this panel. We have quite an array of experts here. To my immediate left, we have Marcus King, who's Director of Research, School of International Affairs at George Washington University, Stephen Cheney, retired Brigadier General in the USMC, and now Chief Executive Officer of the American Security Project. And to his immediate left, Patrick Regan, Professor of Foreign Policy and Peace Studies, Political Science and Peace Studies, my apologies, at the University of Notre Dame. And then finally, Roger Marks, the Souza Director of Population and Environmental Change and Security at the Wilson Center. So with that, I'm going to sort of open it up to our panelists, each of whom is going to deliver a brief presentation of their views on this critical question of how climate change is impacting national security concerns.
Thank you. As a national security analyst, I'd like to identify some of the major megatrends that I see contributing to conflict in the future, and which countries are most prone to that conflict. So I basically see three trends that stand out as drivers in the next 20 years. That is uneven demographic growth, climate change-induced scarcity, which will manifest itself largely as water security issues, and the rise of violent extremists. The number of flashpoints where these trends intersect are going to be the focal points for instability. Combining forecasts from a number of disciplines and sources, these trends converge most alarmingly in the Middle East, North Africa, and the Horn of Africa, as well as the picture will be mixed in some parts of sub-Saharan Africa. The countries of South America's Andean highlands, the Himalayan foothills, and Central Asia are areas of emerging concern, especially with regard to water scarcity. So the trend that seems the most certain of these three is sustained but uneven population growth. World population is about 7 billion, and the average prediction is it'll grow to 11 billion by 2050. This absolute growth is not a problem that will overwhelm the Earth's projected carrying capacity, but the distribution of growth is an alarming issue. In many fragile countries, the average age is getting younger. This is good news in highly productive economies such as Korea that have strong education systems, and new entrants to the labor force are likely to find jobs. However, increasing concentration of economic growth in only a few nations will mean that in the other nations, demands for jobs will exceed supply. So this is something that the social scientists call the population or youth bulge, which generally refers to the shape of the distribution curve where the growth of young adult populations from 18 to 25 bows outward. In areas of Africa sensitive to climate change, about 40% of the population is under 15 and 70% under 30. Unemployment exceeds 20% in many of these areas. So young people in these societies are experiencing what I call a revolution of expectations. This is globalization acting through the medium of mass media, and the internet raises appreciation of consumerism and expectations of professional employment. Those people, predominantly males, who fail at this are the demographic most prone to violent extremism. Next, we bring in climate change's impact on natural and critical infrastructure, and the fact that it's a common denominator for other socio-political challenges in the areas of water, health, and energy. The authoritative data show that overwhelmingly, water, for example, has sparked more incidents of cooperation than conflict. Israel and Jordan held the secret picnic table talks between water specialists at the level of Track 2 diplomacy from 1954 till 1994, even though they were officially at war. I was also pleased to see yesterday that Jordan, Israel, and the Palestinian Authority signed a joint agreement for a $500 million to $1 billion project of desalination and a pipeline to rejuvenate the Dead Sea. So this situation of cooperation around water issues, for example, might be changing. The fifth assessment report on scientific bases of climate change has presented mid-range estimates of increased temperatures of 8 to 9 degrees by the end of the century. It shows that with a high degree of certainty that some of the worst impacts are going to be exactly in these areas where crops and water are most affected by climate change. A subset of these countries already at war are Nigeria, Afghanistan, and Syria, for example. And these are generally internal wars. In March, the IPCC will release a report chapter under Working Group 2 on human security that will underscore the detrimental effects climate change has had and the second and third order effects on social welfare networks, as well as critical infrastructure. So the Pentagon's referred to climate change as an instability accelerant. CNA MAB, where I used to work, has also called it a threat multiplier. Water stress is an aspect of climate change that in and of itself could cause conflict, not just multiply it. So by 2030, the global annual demand for water will exceed supply by 40%. And the threat could be described in this way. The general impacts of climate change are the shark, and the teeth of the shark are water scarcity. So the impacts of water on global security are now close to the forefront of the national security agenda after about the last 10 years. As you probably know, the Department of State commissioned an intelligence community assessment on global water security last year, and it said that during the next 10 years, many countries important to the United States will face water problems, including shortages and poor water quality that will contribute to the risk of instability and state failure. This will also distract our allies and draw the U.S. into new military engagements, not only conflict, but also humanitarian assistance and disaster recovery operations. Water scarcity will also hinder ability of nations to establish new energy sources for their growing populations due to diminished hydropower capacity, which is evident, but also lack of supply for cooling of all types of power reactors, including nuclear and fossil fuel stations. It also will continue to shock global fuel markets, global food markets. In Syria, 800,000 farmers were forced to migrate to urban centers in search of non-existent jobs after a 2-year drought there ending last year. Conditions in those cities eroded confidence in the Assad regime and the capacity to govern, which was the driver for the conflict. So, violent extremism. Islamic extremists are now coming to ascendancy in several wars. Yemen is a hotbed of extremism where the aquifers could be depleted by 2020. The GAIN index clearly shows that current water usage in Yemen exceeds sustainable levels. Virtually all countries where al-Qaeda and its direct affiliates are operating are heavily impacted by climate change. While the intensity of conflict in the major theaters has diminished, the distribution and the absolute number of countries facing extremism is increasing. So quickly, 2 nations stand out as places where these 3 megatrends will converge and probably cause the worst challenges. The first is Nigeria. I haven't seen sufficient evidence that the drought and water scarcity are a motivational cause of the violence by Boko Haram in the north, the violent insurgency. But what we do know is that these conditions are eroding the population's resilience to their attacks. Also, the ongoing insurgency in Niger's southern delta is led by a coalition that has grievances about sharing of oil profits, but also environmental degradation of the water there. So Nigeria's explosive population growth is also providing ample combatants for both internal conflicts. The GAIN index places Nigeria in the area of high vulnerability and low readiness. The GAIN index indicates in Egypt that climate vulnerabilities are manageable, but improvements in readiness will help it to better adapt. Unfortunately, political upheaval has disempowered the environmental ministry there that has already had little focus on building resilience. So the climate challenges for Egypt in the future are very formidable. sea level rise and desertification will both take their toll on the thin fertile zone around the Nile, where nearly all the population and all agricultural activities taking place. And also 100% of the fresh water within Egypt, or nearly 100%, comes from outside the country, and Ethiopia is planning dams. So how can we prevent the realization of these worst outcomes that I've predicted? Scientific global and regional climate circulation models, demographic models for growth, and intelligence agencies' political risk estimates all have some degree of fidelity, in my view, out to about 20 years. But the GAIN index is valuable as a new tool for both national and corporate partners, because it utilizes data and helps us better understand vulnerability and resilience at both the national and subnational levels today. This will contribute to conflict prevention, which is the key, by hopefully informing investments in sustainable infrastructure to avoid some of the worst prospects for violence in the future.
General Cheney?
Certainly. And Joyce, thank you for this opportunity, and Mike, thank you for chairing this. I regret that Admiral Titley's not here today, because some of you may not be aware of the story or the relationship between the United States Navy and Notre Dame. But if you Google it, this is a true story. Snopes will prove it. The Navy saved Notre Dame during World War II, and the payback was perhaps the largest NROTC unit forever since World War II there at Notre Dame. And secondly, the Naval Academy get the pleasure of playing football every year with Notre Dame. Now, you say that might not be a pleasure, but I will tell you, having been a swimmer at the Naval Academy, the athletic program greatly appreciates playing Notre Dame and the exposure for that. So there's a very close relationship, and I have a strong appreciation for Notre Dame. I hope today that I don't prove Winston Churchill's axiom right, that since light travels faster than the speed of sound, some people appear bright before you hear them speak. So let me talk a little bit about my background and then why I'm here. I am the CEO of the American Security Project. We are a 501c3 nonprofit created in 2005 following the 2004 election. And then Senators Kerry, Hagel, Hart, and Rudman got together, and they were so disappointed when you brought up topics like climate change, energy security, nuclear security, asymmetric operations, to name a few, that they got politicized immediately, and nobody looked at the facts, and either you were on the far right or the far left, and you criticize them. So they said, hey, can we put an organization together that would have a board comprised of roughly a third or more flag officers, admirals and generals, another third being politicians, senators, and representatives, in one case Governor Whitman's on our board now, and a third businessmen and women. And we have existed since then to produce studies and hopefully influence public opinion in the Hill on each of those topics that I mentioned from a statistical and factual perspective, using the national security point to all of them, particularly in regards to climate change. We are nonpartisan, and we aim to stay that way. We don't support any one particular candidate or party, but we will support or criticize policies. Now, I know everybody in here knows there are many global security challenges, not just those you read in the headlines. It's not just Iran, Afghanistan, or Egypt. There are overarching strategic challenges that need solutions now. When you look back over the last couple of centuries, look at the second decades. They've been very interesting. 1910, 1920, nobody predicted World War I. 1810, 1820, War of 1812. Now, I'm not saying we're going to have a war this decade, but you're going to see some challenges come up, and I think climate change is going to contribute dramatically to what's going to happen over the next couple of decades. We all know the Cold War is over. The world economy is truly linked. China's out of isolation. There are lots of threats and opportunities, but I'm here to talk about the national security implications, specifically of climate change. Now, I would hope that most in here would agree that there is something happening to our climate. And I'll give you some anecdotal stories, and you're probably wondering why a Marine general cares. In 1999, I went down and took over Parris Island, and the general I was relieving pulled me aside, and he said, you're going to have two big problems here. One was a personnel problem, and he said, the other is going to be hurricanes. And I kind of laughed about it. 60 days later, Hurricane Floyd appeared on the horizon, Category 5 hurricane taking direct aim at Parris Island. Parris Island is 12 feet above mean sea level. The storm surge was predicted to be 20 feet. We had to evacuate 10,000 people, not the least of which were 8,000 recruits, and move them some 200 miles inland. So I, real quick, firsthand found out about hurricanes. Then in 2006, I went down to South Texas and I took over the Marine Military Academy. Not saying bad luck follows me. However, when I flew into South Texas along the Rio Grande back in 2005, 2006, everything was green. I mean, the fields were green. It was lush. It was beautiful. By about 2009, 2010, they were starting to experience the worst drought in their history. And I can tell you today, the cotton crop, corn crop, wheat, sorghum are all decimated along with there is no cattle. I mean, they are gone. Then in 2008, we had a hurricane. And I would have never believed that either. It was a Category 1 named Dolly. Not many people heard about it, but it sat for 24 hours on my campus and did about $10 million worth of damage. Of course, everybody's familiar with Sandy and what that did, and that didn't even get to hurricane level when it struck. But I learned firsthand what the weather can do to you. Now, I'm sure you all know that the last decade was the hottest one in history. This particular year is on course to be the 7th hottest since records have been kept. When you look at the Arctic ice, a study released this past summer predicted that the Northwest Passage would be ice-free by 2015. But as recent as 2 years ago, they were predicting 2050. So there are some dramatic changes. Now, some would say, well, there's an advantage to the ice melting. It cuts 8,000 miles off the shipping route from China to Europe. It opens up the oil fields and mineral exploitation in the Arctic. I'm not sure you would view that as an advantage, at least from the national security perspective. So let me talk about why climate change is a national security threat. There's no doubt it causes instability, it worsens poverty, causes political instability, and it risks conflict. And let me just take a quick tour around the world and hit some spots that you did not hit. Asia, sea rise is going to displace millions of people. Certainly it's going to contribute to disease, in specifically cholera and malaria. It's going to cause the Himalayan glacier to melt. It's going to drive China to scramble for resources, especially water and oil. And in Bangladesh alone, the water level rise over the next 20 years will force 20 million people to relocate. Where are they going to go? I can tell you India is not going to take them. So let's turn around, and your video showed Hurricane Sandy. Of course, you can look at Super Typhoon Haiyan in the Philippines. Last month, 13,000 American soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines engaged in relief efforts across the Philippines. And the need for such missions are going to increase in hotspots all over the world, particularly in Asia. And the militaries of the world are the ones that are probably going to end up responding to most of these. In North Africa, water scarcity is going to drive migration. I'll tell you a short story about the Mali insurrection. The Tuaregs, who are the main participants in that, were driven north in that country by drought. That's what forced them to move, and then, of course, that started the conflagration that's going on there. Some would not associate the forest fires in Russia in 2010 with the Arab Spring, but the massive forest fires in Russia in 2010 caused wheat prices to skyrocket around the world, particularly in the Middle East, and that helped sow the seeds of the unrest for the Arab Spring. There's instability on the borders already. It's feeding instability in Europe. This all leads to further adding to economic instability and political unrest. Our U.S. military bases are certainly threatened. I'll give you one poignant example. Our base in Diego Garcia, which is a major staging base for logistics and what we call maritime pre-positioned shipping, will go underwater in 2 decades. We're going to have to find a place to put all that stuff. We have some 30 other bases and stations under threat from rising waters. Coastal bases in the United States will flood, like Parris Island, or for perhaps the U.S. Naval Air Station in Norfolk. So let's talk a little bit about managing this risk. I think we should all start by acknowledging climate change risks are real and growing every day, and we cannot afford to ignore them. And here's one of my favorite lines. Even if you choose not to believe that human activity contributes to climate change, or even that the climate is changing, from our military experience, we know that waiting for certainty on the battlefield can be disastrous. You better start planning now. Now, managing risk requires a very prudent response, and the first step of which we believe at ASP is an energy debate that addresses the challenges of the 21st century, not one back in the 1970s or devised for the 70s. The greatest dangers lie in being unprepared. And all of this argues for a prudent, no-regrets action which will reduce emissions, build greater resiliency now, in order to reduce future risk. We certainly need to get a grip on man's contribution to climate change. Carbon dioxide emissions are responsible for this increase in climate change. We had better plan to adapt to climate change now, because even if we fix our emissions problems today, it's going to take years, maybe decades, to reverse. The U.S. certainly needs to reduce its carbon emissions, and so does everyone else. The U.S. and China are by far the greatest emitters. Whatever the mechanism, we need to fix this, or we will indeed pay later. We're going to have to plan and be ready for the impacts of climate change. The military has always been very good about planning, and since 2010, when planning for climate change was included in what we call the QDR, the Quadrennial Defense Review, the United States military has been pretty much a global leader in planning for climate change. This indeed has set an example for countries around the world to also prepare for and mitigate the threats of climate change. The American Security Project put out a Global Security and Defense Index last year that showed that over 70% of the countries in the world have acknowledged the threat of climate change on security, and many have begun to plan for the military consequences of climate change. We hope that the 2014 QDR, which is coming up in January, will build on the strength of that particular statement that they have in a QDR on climate. So in conclusion, I just want to say that the real global challenge, it's here and it's with us. And as my board member and co-founder, Senator Gary Hart, said, we need to recommit ourselves to the Republic and work on climate change, on adaptation. It's going to require work, sacrifice, and certainly strategic planning, and hopefully that will ensure our future. Thank you very much.
Professor Reed.
Thank you. Oh, sorry. Go ahead. I'm a bit of a pinch hitter here, and I was given a note that gave me 6 questions and 6 minutes. It's dangerous to be further down the chain because I'm going to sing some of the same song that my colleagues have sung. It's also dangerous to give an academic 6 minutes. Here's what I'm going to do. The first question is whether climate change contributes or has potentially contributes to conflict in the world. I study civil wars. I think the first thing to keep in mind is understanding conflict is hard because they're complex phenomena that no one issue is really going to be a driver for it. But I think of civil wars as something of a domestic bargain gone wrong. And what domestic folks bargain over is the distribution of resources, and as we squeeze the resources, we make it more difficult to redistribute them in a way. So climate pressures should affect the amount of conflict that we see. The evidence, however, seems to be incredibly mixed in spite of the specific cases that were identified. There's a recent Science article that came out that made this definitive claim that climate drives conflict. To my mind, the reviewers were a little lax in that paper. Much of the other evidence just suggests it's uncertain at this stage. I happen to think that that's the ambiguity of the evidence is really a function of the physical scientists and the social scientists not meshing well together, and it's the theory and the research design and the evidence just need to be more closely tied together. But I think that the results should point in that direction. Let me give you an example. The U.S. Department of Defense estimates that I think it's by 2060. I was given 7 minutes to prepare for my 6 minutes, so I might be off in dates and sizes and things. They estimate that 600 square kilometers of arable land in Africa will go offline by 2060. And I believe 600,000 square kilometers of land would translate into something on the order of a swath of land 180 miles wide, 2,000 miles across the United States. If you took that out of the United States, we would have a food scarcity problem and we would have a migration problem. And when refugees go somewhere, they're going to go to some place that's currently occupied. So that bargain over domestic resources is just going to get incredibly more difficult. So it should be a problem for stability, and 6,000 square kilometers is a lot of real estate that's currently productive to take offline. If we're incapable of redistributing it, then I think we should have conflict, or the model should predict conflict. However, and I'm going to speak to this a little bit later in my answer to the third, I believe the third question, adaptation may provide a mechanism for increased cooperation. And I think we know pitifully little about this, and it would suggest that there might be competing pressures over the impetus or the climate drivers of conflict. I'll come back to that in a minute. The second question, are there conflicts that you think catalyze or exacerbated, are catalyzed or exacerbated by climate change? I think the Darfur region of Sudan is just a clear example of this. Many tens of thousands of women and girls have been raped in that conflict. Some hundreds of thousands have been killed, all people. A British parliamentary report tied that directly to the challenge of competing over increasingly scarce resource called arable land. So as the desert encroached in the region, two people who shared that region for centuries suddenly found themselves in conflict, and it was a particularly, I should say is, a particularly gruesome conflict from the perspective of the social ramifications of it. So if nothing else, there are examples out there, as you two point to others, where we ignore this at our peril, maybe. The third question, or a third question, is whether food, water, health, or habitats are the major drivers of conflict, and are there particular things government should do to make these more resilient? By my way of thinking, they all can be drivers of conflict, and they're all interrelated in that driving process. So, for example, the Jordan River, which has been spoken of, if that dries up, you have conflict. You can't take the Jordan River out of the Middle East without having some people be slightly out of joint with it. And it doesn't matter whether it dries up geologically or it dries up politically. We know there'll be conflict over that one river. Crop yields lead to migration, and because of food insecurity. So if you increase the internal migration patterns because of a reduction in something as simple as water, you're going to increase the pressures on that society. And I think we know from public health type issues that our health is affected by nutrition and our environment. So if you increase food security and therefore reduce nutritional viability, you put stress on a society in ways that will be hard to cope with. I have a note here, and this is just to reiterate it, that I'm going to say it one more time before I'm done. Adaptation and conflict is something that we know perilously little about, because these are the types of things that we could and should know about, but they're some forms of proactive policies that we could intervene with. I'm going to skip a couple questions, in part because my 6 minutes will run out, but in part because I don't feel like I can speak to them intelligently. The sixth question is here is, do you think that collaborating across geographies on a resiliency project lays the groundwork for more peaceful outcomes? There is an argument that if you can work on adaptation, you can generate cooperation. The theory would say that if you cooperate over the hardest issue, then cooperating over other issues simply become more doable. Riparian agreements are at the forefront of this evidence. So there's evidence out there of two states negotiate over a water boundary in a way that redistributes that water effectively, that the two states become dyadically more peaceful in that regard. This is yet to be applied fully to internal dynamics. What happens when one region of one country begins to dry up and they negotiate over that? Does that lead to greater intercultural cooperation? I think that's something that we need to know more about. There is a large NSF grant out of the University of Colorado that is trying to get a handle on some of these issues. What happens when you cooperate over climate-based, and what they generally mean is riparian conflicts. And that should lend some insight to maybe how we think about it, but how the world reacts to it. That must come perilously close to my 6 minutes, so I will give it back.
And finally, our cleanup hitter.
Sure, great. Thank you very much. I'd like to start by actually telling a few stories. So when Superstorm Sandy hit the United States, I was actually in Bangladesh at the time. And my colleagues in Bangladesh said, boy, you Americans, what's the big deal? We face the vulnerability of a Superstorm Sandy all the time. This is our life. And then a few months later, I was once again in Bangladesh, and all of the operations and work that we had been doing had been closed down because of political conflict, and we couldn't do work. And once again, I was just reminded the reality of the existence of the Bangladeshis and having to deal with this on a regular basis. The second story I wanted to mention was based on a time that I was giving a talk to a number of U.S. military personnel and diplomats, also folks, foreign service officers, who were being sent to Africa. And we were at the National Defense University, and they had asked for a briefing and training about the security dimensions around climate change and what it meant for these U.S. diplomats going abroad and how they should carry out their work. And one of the questions that I got from military personnel was, well, what's the role of family planning and reproductive health and women's empowerment? And I thought, wow, really? This had become a very nuanced discussion above and beyond just looking at demographic trends or migration, a very subtle and sophisticated analysis of how demographics fit in to these questions around climate change and security. And interestingly enough, I was able to share with them examples and work that had been done by climate change modelers who were incorporating demographics above and beyond just a static one point in time number, and looking at a meaningful analysis of this around what at that time was being called population and climate change hotspots, which was an analysis that was done by an organization called Population Action International that was looking at questions around water scarcity, water availability, population growth, declining agricultural production, and an ability to respond to climate change impacts, an index that had been developed working with climate change modelers. And that analysis points to 26 global population and climate change hotspots, primarily in sub-Saharan Africa. But a lot of the work that integrates these issues actually has been done in the Philippines and actually in Tacloban City, where I was a few months ago before the latest storm hit. So even in those countries where there's very successful integration of these efforts, there's continuing high vulnerability. And the final story I wanted to mention was around an initiative that's called the Resilience Academy, of which we at the Woodrow Wilson Center are a part. And this is an academy that has been convened by the UN University and Munich Re, which is one of the large insurance companies in Germany, looking at resiliency and what this means in the face of climate change impacts. And some of the key questions that we have been examining from a very practical perspective is, what is the role of conflict and peace building, and how does it fit in? Resiliency of what? To what? For whom? How do how do power dynamics fit in to looking at questions around resiliency? And a lot of the criticisms around this approach is looking at how do you move from ecosystem resilience as a response to climate change impacts to social resilience when we talk about community and systemic resilience. Finally, we have been facilitating a number of discussions with African conflict and peace building specialists, and we recently met in Ethiopia to talk about conflict and adaptation and what this means. And in those discussions, we were once again reminded that approximately we're looking at about 1.5 billion people who are living in conflict-affected, post-conflict, or fragile countries. Many of these countries are vulnerable to climate change impacts. And recognizing the points that Patrick makes about the link and the causality between these issues, there is, I think, research that supports that climate vulnerability and change does exacerbate conflict dynamics and can lead to new conflict dynamics, that conflict can reduce communities' resilience to climate vulnerability and changes, and that these factors can interact to deepen complex crises. We've seen these in countries like Sudan, Somalia, Kenya, Ethiopia, Mali, Tanzania, DRC, Niger, and the list goes on. Some of the grounds for optimism and a new approach that's being put forth to really have a sense of how climate change adaptation, conflict, and response can be approached is a development-first adaptation approach that is recognizing this threat multiplier that Marcus was talking about earlier, and is really developing a response in climate change programming that is building on do no harm principles around conflict sensitivity and peace building efforts, and using that as a very comprehensive framework for development programming that gets to questions of overall resiliency building, stability, and reducing vulnerability. And these objectives, sort of overall development objectives, focus on questions around security, national security, a healthy population, and a happy and cohesive society, and is really looking at questions around inputs like clean water, a functional road system, and enabling environment, and examining how that really helps reduce conflict, looking at stressors, constraints, and impediments that could include issues like higher temperature, more intense rainfall, non-climate stressors like a sophisticated analysis of demographics, climate opportunities that may arise, and then sort of recognizing barriers. And using this, and this is actually a new framework that is being implemented by development practitioners like USAID as part of their climate adaptation programming to really be comprehensive in including conflict sensitivity analysis as they move forward. So I think this is one area of optimism and hope that's being developed now, that is emerging, that provides a framework for us to pull all of these issues together. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to pose a couple of questions to the panel and then open it up to the audience. It does seem to me, as Professor Regan suggested, that there is still a great deal of uncertainty about to what extent climate change affects are an instability accelerant, as the Pentagon put it, or in that sense, to what extent does this affect already ongoing conflicts or conflicts that would occur otherwise? It does seem that in some cases you could predict, for example, that if by 2060, 6,000 square kilometers of land in Africa were to become non-arable, that the populations in those areas would fall into conflict. Certainly you can base some of that on what's already happened in some of these conflict regions that General Cheney pointed to. But how often is it predictable that the climate effects become part of or a generator for conflict? Is it something that you just sort of look at and determine afterwards, as you did in a couple of cases you cited? To what extent should planners at the Pentagon and elsewhere be looking more at the likelihood that U.S. Military resources will have to be deployed to rescue people, as in the case of the super typhoon in Philippines, that will be the main task in the national security sphere. I just wonder, you know, if you could all comment on this a little bit more. To what extent do we need a lot more study, do you think, of the ability to predict when climate becomes a major factor in actual conflict, as opposed to, you know, should we simply just be setting aside resources for even more rescues in the future?
You know, Mike, when you look at the organization of the United States military, and I think most of you are familiar with it, there's geographic commands, the whole world's covered. Each one's got a J5 plans section, as does the Joint Staff. And that's why I mentioned when the QDR started to include climate change in 2010, clearly there was a recognition here that it's a big threat. And obviously, when I mentioned the Philippines, for instance, the United States military is going to have to respond in not every case, but a number of cases. So the immediate disasters you can all recognize, like this typhoon in the Philippines. But even going farther, when you pull the string farther, as I mentioned, like with the forest fires in Russia, I mean, that's a bit of a stretch. But planners have to look at things like that to figure out what's the worst case scenario, and then draw the line there with what assets you have for the geographic commander to respond to those problems. And then this gets into the terrorism side of the house, and as you all addressed here, there's movement here, Al Qaeda and others. They've got to go where resources are as well. So I mean, I think that type of planning is becoming far more common within the Pentagon now than it ever has been. And I think there's a recognition of it. Certainly a recognition among the military. I was asked a question a little while back. They said, you know, some of these military guys just don't get it. And I said, boy, I think you're wrong. I really think you're wrong, especially at the senior level. Flag officers, general and admirals, they recognize that this is a huge problem and one that they need to look at.
Because it's a whole other layer of complexity, I mean, are you calculating probabilities in effect using supercomputers? Is that how it works?
Well, they war game it. I don't know the specifics about actuarials or doing that type of thing, so I don't know, but I would suspect there is somebody trying to put a number on it.
Yeah,
Somebody here might know better than I.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I almost feel like coming over there and hugging you. But I think you point to one of the differences between climate science or physical science and social science in some ways. Climate science, and much of what we talk about, is on projections through modeling. So they model, given a set of historic conditions, they model the future, and then the confidence is a function of how far out you stretch it. In the social sciences, we tend to what we do call post-stick. We only have wars that already happened. We can't model future wars in that sense. And if you were to put, and I'm sure they're out there, some physical scientists, hydrologists, ecologists in a room, say, here's what we do, their theories would point to much more specific pressures on a geographic environment through water discharge, snow melt, evaporation rates. Social scientists tend to take rainfall as the proxy. So we say, well, did it rain a lot over Bangladesh? Whew, man, it rained like crazy, and they had a conflict. But it's not a good proxy for the complexity of what climate change will do to the environments that we live in. So I think what needs to happen. So your answer is, social science models aren't capable of making good, strong predictions. We generally don't forecast as a starting point. But the physical sciences that their models would make good predictions, and actually local predictions, need to interact with social scientists who make more broad stroke predictions based on really gross generalizations of what might be a proxy for climate change. So that's someplace that I think research needs to go.
Any further thoughts on that?
I wanted to say that I think it's important to concentrate on the observed phenomenon that may or may not be analogs of climate change in particular. So we know there are more wildfires. We know that storms are becoming more frequent and intense. We know there are an increased number of droughts, and there's water scarcity. We're not sure the exact tie that it might have to climate change, and a lot of that bogs the national security community down into a political argument suggesting that it's anthropogenically caused, that it's man-made, a man-made problem. But instead, I think it's better just focus on the observed phenomenon and not necessarily worry about the link to climate change, but incorporate what is definitely observed, what is definitely happening into national security planning.